students, welcome to Sunil's tutorial. I'm Sunil Milwani and today we'll be doing this chapter called as genetic basis of inheritance. First, let's understand what is genetics. What do we understand by genetics? Now, it is a branch of bio which deals with heredity and variation transmitted in living organism from one generation to another generation. Right? You have many of the characteristics like that of your parents, right? But you don't have all the characteristics of your parents. You have some different characteristics also, right? So those characteristics that you have similar, that's heredity. You have some different characteristics, that's variation. So the branch of bio that deals with heredity and variation of living organism from one generation to another generation. You have a lot of characteristics similar to that of your parents and some other different characteristics. That is called as genetics. So what is genetics? It is a branch of experimental bio which deals with heredity and variation, variations transmitted in living organism from one generation to next generation. Right? Who came up with this word genetics? The term was first used by Bredesen in 1906. That was the first time that the word genetics was used. Now, there are two important terms in that definition. One is heredity and the other is variation. Let's try to see both the terms in detail. What do we understand by heredity? Heredity, it is the transmission of characters from parents to offspring. As I told you that you have a lot of characteristics similar to that of your parents. This transmission of characteristics from the parents to offspring is called as heredity. When you have certain characteristics that resemble your parents, then that is called as heredity. Fine, do we get this thing here? So all offsprings resemble their parents due to acquired characters from their parents. Fine, do we get this thing here? So in heredity, you are going to study why you have multiple characteristics that are similar to that of your parents. Right? Why is it that there's transmission of characteristics from one generation to another generation? Fine. It is defined as the transmission of characters from the parents to the offspring. Right? All the offsprings resemble their parents due to the acquired characters from their parents. That's heredity, right? Transmission of characteristics from one generation to another generation. Next, what do I understand by variation? Now, the difference between the individuals of the same species is called as variation. No two individuals are same. Right? There will always be some difference between them. No two individuals of a species are exact copies of one another, because the characters transmitted to the offspring differ in each cases. Now, if you are siblings from the same parents, even then there is going to be some difference in the characteristics that you have. That is called as variation. The transmission of characteristics from one generation to another generation may not be the same. The same characteristics may not be transferred into you and your sibling. So this difference is called as variation. So what is variation? Variation is the difference between the individuals of the same species. Right? What do we understand by variation? Variation is the difference between the individuals of the same species, because you don't have the same characters, characters that are transmitted from one generation to another generation. Right? So what is variation? The difference between the individuals of the same species are called variation. Right? No two individuals of the species are exact copies of one another, because the characters transmitted to the offspring differ in each case. Right? So that's how you have variation. So what is genetics? Genetics studies why you have certain characteristics similar between two individuals and why all characteristics are not similar between two individuals. Why is it that there are some characteristics that are different between two individuals? That is what is genetics. Now on the basis of this, you have a phrase which says that like begets like. Like begets like. Now what do you mean by this? All living organisms produce offsprings that resemble their parents in majority of characteristics. A sunflower would produce a sunflower. An elephant would produce an elephant. It's not that an elephant would produce a dog. Not possible. Right? So you would have all offsprings that would resemble their parents in majority of characteristics, and that is the reason why it is said that like begets like. You will resemble exactly, you will have majority of characteristics exactly similar to what your parents have. Right? So what is like begets like? All living organisms produce offsprings which resemble their parents in majority of characters. example, all sunflower plants will sunflower plants produce sunflower seedlings during cultivation. Similarly, all elephants give birth to baby elephants. So that's the meaning of like begets like, right? So that now the modern cell theory says that new cells are produced from pre-existing cells of living organism. That means all living objects would show heredity and variation. Since all cells are produced from pre-existing cells, they would have characteristics of pre-existing cell, and they may not have all the characteristics of pre-existing cell. That is the reason why we say that all living objects would show heredity and variation. The members of the same or related species show similarity with one another, and this is called as heredity, right? So thus we could say that heredity is the transmission of set of characters from parents to offsprings. The offsprings resemble their parents due to the acquired characters from their parents. That is heredity. Next, variation is the dissimilarity between members of the same species, right? The continuity of species takes place through sexual reproduction to produce new individuals of the same kind, but no two individuals of the species are exact copies of each other. They show certain dissimilarities in their characteristics, and those dissimilarities are called as variation. So that's your heredity and variation. Thus, I could say that heredity and variation are the basic characteristic features of all living organisms, right? So genetics deals with heredity and variations of organisms. As I've already explained to you that the term genetics was first coined by Peterson in 1906, right? Now, the heredity characters are transmitted from parents to offspring through genes or chromosomes, right? At the same time, the members of the species differ from each other in many characteristics. So, these differences are due to the reshuffling of parental characters during sexual reproduction. There are certain characteristics that reshuffle. So, those result in variation. Right? Now, let's see certain historical account of inheritance. Did we know about inheritance right from beginning of time? Let's see historical account of inheritance. In ancient times, people started domesticating plants and animals. Domesticating plants and animals, right? So, thousands of years ago, the ancient man started to know about the artificial selection of genetic variation and had also learned about heredity. Thousands of years ago, the ancient man started to know about artificial selection artificial selection of genetic variations and also learned about heredity. Now let's come to know one time. In the 19th century, you had scientists by the name Sheldon and Schwann who proposed the cell theory. And showed that new cells are always produced from pre-existing cells by cell division. He proposed the cell theory and showed that new cells are always produced from pre-existing cells by cell division. Right? Then you had Charles Darwin. He proposed the theory of natural selection and the hypothesis of pangenesis. Charles Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection and hypothesis of pangenesis. What is the hypothesis of pangenesis? That every part produces a gamete. Every part in a living organism would produce a gamete, and these get transmitted during sexual reproduction of offsprings. Right? So there would be gametes that would be produced, and these gametes would be transferred during sexual reproduction of the offspring. That was my hypothesis of pangenesis. So that is every part of an organism, part of an organism produces gamete, right? And these get transmitted during sexual reproduction. These get transmitted during sexual reproduction to the offspring. That was Charles Darwin's theory. Then we had another theory that was propounded by August Weismann. This theory was propounded in 1892. Right? Now, August Weismann postulated that living organisms show two types of material, somatoplasm and germplasm. Somatoplasm develops into the body parts of the organism, while germplasm maintains the continuity of species in the next succeeding generation. Right? So he postulated that living organisms show two types of material, like somatoplasm and germplasm. He said that body is made up of two types of material, somatoplasm and germplasm. Somatoplasm develops into the body parts of the organism. Somatoplasm develops into the body parts of the organism. Right? While germplasm maintains the continuity of species. While germplasm maintains the continuity of species. Right? Then you had another theory that was propounded by according to Kohl-Retief. According to Kohl-Retief, hereditary units tend to remain discrete in different generations. Right? When he worked on some breeding experiments on different species of tobacco, he gave evidence that about hereditary units. So he came up with the theory that there is a specific unit in the body that is responsible for transmission of characteristics from one generation to another. He called those specific parts to be hereditary units. Right? So, according to him, hereditary units tend to remain discrete in different generations. Right? They are separate in different generations. Already come to know this when he worked on some breeding experiments. When he worked on some breeding experiments of different species, of tobacco, he gave some experimental evidence about hereditary units. He gave some experimental evidence about hereditary units. Right? Then came another scientist, Mendel. were called Johann Mendel, 1866. Right? He was the pioneer to show that hereditary characteristics are small units of reproductive cells of the parents. He said that in the reproductive cell there are small units which are called as hereditary units, and these are transmitted from the parents to the offspring. Right? He was also the first scientist to use the term factors for hereditary units. Instead of calling them as hereditary units, he called them factors. Right? And today we call those factors as gene. And the gene theory which is now accepted today is the gene theory is now accepted universally as the fundamental unit of life. So he can be called as the father of genetics. Right? Was the pioneer to show that hereditary characteristics were small units from reproductive cells hereditary units were small units from reproductive cells of the parents transmitted to the offspring. Right? He used the term factor. He was the one who used the term factor for hereditary units. Right? Today we call it as genes. Right? The gene theory is now accepted as accepted universally as the fundamental unit of life. The gene theory is now accepted universally as the fundamental unit of life. Right? So that's your historical account of inheritance, different scientists and the different theories that were propounded by them. Now, let's come to Mendel's theory of inheritance. Mendel's theory of inheritance. Now, Mendel chose garden pea plant for his experiments for controlled hybridization. He worked on garden pea plants for almost 10 years and reported the results of some of his experiments. In the beginning of 20th century, his work was rediscovered by 3 biologists and who worked independently on his theory, and then they came up with the laws of heredity, and they are called as the Mendel's law of heredity, which are the foundations of modern genetics. Hence, Mendel is regarded as the father of modern genetics. He was the one who initially did the experiments, he recorded the results, he published some results, they were accepted, some of them were accepted then, Then we had another three scientists in the beginning of 20th century who worked on his experiments and found out that yes, it was whatever he had said was actually the basis of inheritance, and on the basis of that, certain laws were propounded which are called as the laws of heredity, and that's the reason why Mendel is called as the father of modern genetics. Mendel chose the garden pea plant for his experiments for controlled hybridization. Right? He worked on garden pea plants for nearly 10 years. He worked on garden pea plant for nearly 10 years and reported the results of some of his experiments. Right? Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, you had Mendel's work was rediscovered. By three biologists. Their names are Hugo de Vries. Then you had this guys from Holland. Then you had Van Chesmark. This guy is from Austria, and the third is Collins. He is from Germany. So you have these three different biologists who worked on Mendel's work independently. Right? And Mendel's law of inheritance is said to be the foundation of modern genetics. Mendel's laws of inheritance is said to be the foundation of modern genetics. Hence, he is regarded as the father of modern genetics. Hence, he is regarded as the father of modern genetics. And do we understand here? So, do we understand the basics of genetics, right? Okay, we'll stop this here for the day. Thank you very much.